At the will reading, the lawyer looked up from his paperwork and announced that I had inherited a rundown house and exactly $30. The entire room exploded with cruel, mocking laughter. My father sneered at me across the mahogany table, telling me I had wasted my time on a broke old woman, and now I was stuck with a pile of junk. I did not cry or scream. I just smiled, took the envelope, and walked out. What my arrogant family did not know was that the serial numbers on those old bills would lead me to a truth that would completely shatter their fraudulent empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth. My name is Maya. I am 29 years old and I work as a forensic accountant. Growing up in an affluent African-American family in Atlanta, Georgia, meant living inside a fortress of expectations. My father, Jeremiah, built a massive logistics and trucking empire from the ground up. He and my mother, Brenda, lived for appearances, designer clothes, luxury cars, and making sure everyone at their exclusive Buckhead Country Club knew exactly how wealthy they were. They despised anything that reminded them of their humble beginnings. Most of all, they resented my father's mother, Grandma Ruby. Grandma Ruby lived in the historic West End of Atlanta. She was a quiet, observant woman who saw right through my parents' greed and materialism. While my older sister Aaliyah was groomed to take over the family business, I spent my weekends sitting on Grandma Ruby's porch, drinking sweet tea and listening to her stories. My family treated her like an embarrassing secret, a stain on their perfect high society image. But to me, she was the only person who recognized my true value. I refused to join my father's company, choosing instead to earn a degree in forensic accounting. My family called me a failure. They mocked my career choice, telling everyone I was wasting my life working a boring desk job instead of embracing the fabulous lifestyle they felt we were entitled to. When Grandma Ruby passed away, my family did not shed a single tear. They only cared about liquidating whatever meager assets she had left behind. That is how we all ended up sitting in a high-end law office in Buckhead on a rainy Tuesday morning. The room smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. My parents sat at the head of the conference table, radiating impatience. Next to them sat Aaliyah, wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly rent. She is the vice president of marketing at my father's company, a title she earned entirely by stealing credit for other people's hard work. Beside her sat Trent, her white husband, and the chief financial officer of our family business. Trent was a smarmy Wall Street type who constantly dropped microaggressions and operated under the delusion that he was the smartest man in any room. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading the distribution of assets. Grandma Ruby had established several trust funds years ago. The lawyer announced that millions of dollars were to be allocated to my parents and my sister. Aaliyah flipped her hair, looking incredibly pleased with herself. My mother nodded approvingly, adjusting her diamond necklace as if she had just won a prize she rightfully deserved. Trent leaned back in his chair, tapping his expensive pen against the table with a smug expression. Then the lawyer flipped to the final page. He hesitated, looking distinctly uncomfortable as he glanced in my direction. He announced that to her granddaughter Maya Ruby leaves the property located in the West End, along with exactly $30 in cash. The silence in the room lasted for barely a second before the eruption happened. Aaliyah let out a loud theatrical gasp before bursting into laughter. Trent chuckled, shaking his head as he looked at me with pure condescension. He asked if my fancy forensic accounting degree could calculate the return on investment for $30. He told me I should frame the money to remind myself of what a terrible business decision I had made by playing the devoted granddaughter. My father slammed his hand on the table, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. His voice echoed off the glass walls as he told me I had wasted 10 years of my youth visiting a broke old woman in the hood. He said I was finally getting what I deserved, a pile of junk and bus fare. He pointed a heavy finger at me and warned me not to come crying to him when the city demanded property taxes for a house that was barely standing. My mother simply rolled her eyes and muttered that I had always been the embarrassment of the family, completely lacking any ambition or common sense. They waited for my reaction. They wanted me to break down, to yell, to beg for a share of their newly inherited millions. They wanted to see me humiliated. Instead, I stood up slowly and calmly smoothed the wrinkles from my suit. I reached across the table and picked up the small manila envelope containing my inheritance. I looked at the four people who shared my blood but possessed none of my loyalty. I gave them a bright, genuine smile. I thanked them for showing me exactly what they valued, and I turned my back on them. I walked out the heavy glass doors of the law office, ignoring my father calling out that I was a dramatic failure. I took the elevator down to the parking garage, my heart beating steadily in my chest. When I got into my car, I locked the doors and opened the thin manila envelope. Inside were two pieces of currency. One was a crisp $20 bill from the year 1928. The other was an old $10 bill. I held them up to the steering wheel, examining them closely. My training as a forensic accountant made me naturally observant, and Grandma Ruby knew that better than anyone. I looked at the serial numbers printed on the bills. They were not standard sequences. I pulled a notepad from my glove compartment and wrote the numbers down. The sequence on the $20 bill perfectly matched the format of an international routing number for a specific offshore bank. The numbers on the $10 bill were separated in a way that mimicked precise geographical coordinates. I stared at the paper as a cold realization washed over me. Grandma Ruby was never a broke old woman. She had left me a map, and the $30 in my hand was the key to exposing a secret my family had buried decades ago. At my grandmother's will reading, the lawyer looked up from his mahogany desk and announced that I had inherited a rundown house in the West End and exactly $30 in cash. The entire room exploded into cruel, mocking laughter. My father sneered at me across the table, telling me I had wasted my time on a broke old woman, and now I was stuck with a pile of junk. I did not cry or scream. I just smiled, took the envelope, and walked out. What my arrogant family did not know was that the serial numbers on those old bills would lead me to a truth that would completely shatter their fraudulent empire and bring them all to their knees. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth. My name is Maya. I am 29 years old and I work as a forensic accountant. Growing up in an affluent African-American family in Atlanta, Georgia, meant living inside a fortress of exhausting expectations. My father, Jeremiah, built a massive logistics and trucking empire from the ground up. He and my mother, Brenda, lived entirely for appearances. They were obsessed with designer clothes, luxury cars, and making sure everyone at their exclusive Buckhead Country Club knew exactly how wealthy they were. They despised anything that reminded them of their humble beginnings. Most of all, they resented my father's own mother, Grandma Ruby. Grandma Ruby lived in the historic West End of Atlanta. She was a quiet, observant woman who saw right through my parents' greed and materialism. While my older sister Aaliyah was groomed to take over the family business, I spent my weekends sitting on Grandma Ruby's porch, drinking sweet tea and listening to her stories. My family treated her like an embarrassing secret, a stain on their perfect high society image. But to me, she was the only person who recognized my true value. I refused to join my father's company, choosing instead to earn a degree in forensic accounting. My family called me a failure. They mocked my career choice, telling everyone I was wasting my life working a boring desk job instead of embracing the fabulous corporate lifestyle they felt we were entitled to. When Grandma Ruby passed away, my family did not shed a single tear. They only cared about liquidating whatever meager assets she had left behind. That is how we all ended up sitting in a high-end law office in Buckhead on a rainy Tuesday morning. The room smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. My parents sat at the head of the conference table, radiating impatience. Next to them sat Aaliyah, wearing a designer dress that cost more than my monthly rent. She is the vice president of marketing at my father's company, a title she earned entirely by stealing credit for other people's hard work. Beside her sat Trent, her white husband, and the chief financial officer of our family business. Trent was a smarmy Wall Street type who constantly dropped microaggressions and operated under the delusion that he was the smartest man in any room. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading the distribution of assets. Grandma Ruby had established several trust funds years ago. The lawyer announced that millions of dollars were to be allocated to my parents and my sister. Aaliyah flipped her hair, looking incredibly pleased with herself. My mother nodded approvingly, adjusting her diamond necklace as if she had just won a prize she rightfully deserved. Trent leaned back in his chair, tapping his expensive pen against the table with a smug expression. Then the lawyer flipped to the final page. He hesitated, looking distinctly uncomfortable as he glanced in my direction. He announced that to her granddaughter Maya, Ruby leaves the property located in the West End, along with exactly $30 in cash. The silence in the room lasted for barely a second before the eruption happened. Aaliyah let out a loud, theatrical gasp before bursting into laughter. Trent chuckled, shaking his head as he looked at me with pure condescension. He asked if my fancy forensic accounting degree could calculate the return on investment for $30. He told me I should frame the money to remind myself of what a terrible business decision I had made by playing the devoted granddaughter. My father slammed his hand on the table, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. His voice echoed off the glass walls as he told me I had wasted 10 years of my youth visiting a broke old woman in the hood. He said I was finally getting what I deserved, a pile of junk and bus fare. He pointed a heavy finger at me and warned me not to come crying to him when the city demanded property taxes for a house that was barely standing. My mother simply rolled her eyes and muttered that I had always been the embarrassment of the family, completely lacking any ambition or common sense. They waited for my reaction. They wanted me to break down, to yell, to beg for a share of their newly inherited millions. They wanted to see me humiliated. Instead, I stood up slowly and calmly smoothed the wrinkles from my suit. I reached across the table and picked up the small manila envelope containing my inheritance. I looked at the 4 people who shared my blood but possessed none of my loyalty. I gave them a bright, genuine smile. I thanked them for showing me exactly what they valued, and I turned my back on them. I walked out the heavy glass doors of the law office, ignoring my father calling out that I was a dramatic failure. I took the elevator down to the parking garage, my heart beating steadily in my chest. When I got into my car, I locked the doors and opened the thin manila envelope. Inside were 2 pieces of currency. One was a crisp $20 bill from the year 1928. The other was an incredibly worn $10 bill. I held them up to the steering wheel, examining them closely. My training as a forensic accountant made me naturally observant, and Grandma Ruby knew that better than anyone. I looked at the serial numbers printed on the bills. They were not standard sequences. I pulled a notepad from my glove compartment and wrote the numbers down. The sequence on the $20 bill perfectly matched the format of an international routing number for a specific offshore bank. The numbers on the $10 bill were separated in a way that mimicked precise geographical coordinates. I stared at the paper as a cold realization washed over me. Grandma Ruby was never a broke old woman. She had left me a map, and the $30 in my hand was the key to exposing a secret my family had buried decades ago. I started the engine and drove straight to the West End. The neighborhood was rapidly gentrifying, but Grandma Ruby's house remained untouched, a stubborn piece of history amidst the new developments. The paint was peeling, and the porch steps creaked under my weight as I unlocked the front door. The house smelled of dried lavender and old paper. I walked directly to the center of the living room, using the coordinates from the $10 bill to guide my steps. The numbers aligned perfectly with the architecture of the house, leading me straight to the dark, narrow space beneath the main staircase. I knelt on the dusty floorboards and tapped against the wood. One plank sounded hollow. I pried it up with a screwdriver I found in the kitchen, revealing a heavy vintage Mosler floor safe hidden in the foundation. My hands trembled slightly as I brushed the dust off the combination dial. I used the last 6 digits of the routing number from the $20 bill. Turn right to 42, turn left to 18, turn right to 7. The heavy metal mechanism clicked into place with a satisfying thud. Just as I reached to pull the heavy handle up, a deafening crash echoed through the house. The front door was violently kicked open, splintering the wood against the wall. Heavy work boots stomped into the living room. I quickly dropped the floorboard back over the safe and stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees. My father strode into the room, his face twisted in a dark scowl. Right behind him was Trent, looking perfectly out of place in his tailored Italian suit. They were flanked by three massive men wearing hard hats and neon vests, a demolition crew. My father did not waste time with pleasantries. He pulled a folded check from his jacket pocket and threw it at my feet. It fluttered to the ground, landing in the dust. He demanded that I sign the deed over to him immediately. He informed me that the Vanguard Group, a massive real estate conglomerate, was buying up the entire block for a luxury mega condo project. He said he needed this specific plot of land to finalize the multi-million-dollar deal, and he was not going to let my sentimental attachment ruin his payday. He told me to take the $50,000 check, get my trash out of the house, and leave before the bulldozers tore the roof off. Trent stepped forward, shoving his hands into his pockets, with that familiar patronizing smirk. He told me I needed to listen to the men in the room who actually understood economics. He mansplained that property taxes in a gentrifying neighborhood would bankrupt me within a year. He said I was just a girl playing with numbers at a desk while they were making real moves in the corporate world. He told me to be a good little girl, take the pocket change, and go back to my apartment. I looked down at the $50,000 check, then back up at the demolition crew standing in my grandmother's living room. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I slowly bent down, picked up the check, and tore it neatly down the middle. I dropped the pieces back onto the floor. I looked Trent dead in the eye and cited the exact federal and state property laws regarding illegal eviction and unauthorized demolition. I informed him that because the deed was officially transferred to my name as of 10 o'clock this morning, any attempt to alter or destroy the property without my signature constituted a federal crime punishable by severe fines and immediate arrest. I pulled out my phone and held it up, noting that I was already recording the entire interaction, including their forced entry and attempted coercion. I turned my gaze to the foreman of the demolition crew. I told him that if his men so much as scratched the paint on the walls, I would personally ensure his contracting license was revoked and his company sued into oblivion. The foreman looked at my father, then at the camera in my hand. He muttered an apology, signaled his men, and they immediately backed out of the house, returning to their trucks. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He stepped toward me, raising a finger as if to strike me, but he caught himself. He hissed that I was making the biggest mistake of my miserable life. He swore he would drag me through court, freeze my meager bank accounts, and ensure I ended up with absolutely nothing. Trent sneered, calling me a stubborn idiot before following my father out the door. They promised they would be back with a court order by Monday. I waited until their luxury SUV sped away down the street before I locked the broken door as best as I could. The house was silent again. I returned to the space beneath the stairs, removed the floorboard, and pulled open the heavy door of the Mosler safe. I expected to find stacks of cash or perhaps old jewelry. Instead, the safe was entirely empty except for a single yellowed legal document housed inside a protective plastic sleeve. I carefully pulled it out and read the embossed text at the top of the page. It was a contract for the transfer of bearer shares dated 1985. As I read the fine print, the entire foundation of my family's wealth suddenly made sense. The document proved that my father did not build his trucking empire from scratch. He had nearly gone bankrupt, facing federal prison for fraud in his 20s. Grandma Ruby had bailed him out using her own secret savings, but she had not given him the money for free. She had secured 100% of the bearer shares for Jeremiah Logistics. My father had spent his entire life acting like a self-made king, looking down on the woman who had saved him. He had legally operated the company as a proxy, but the empire did not belong to him. It never did. It belonged to Grandma Ruby. And according to the final clause in her newly executed will, those shares and all their corresponding assets transferred directly to me. My father and Trent thought they were going to freeze my bank accounts and steal my land for a real estate deal. What they did not know was that holding this single piece of paper meant I was now the sole legal owner of their entire corporate empire. I slid the document into my briefcase, smiled into the dusty darkness of the house, and prepared to show my family exactly what the return on investment of $30 truly looked like. The heavy oak doors of the Buckhead Heritage Club loomed ahead. It was Saturday evening, the night of my parents' 35th wedding anniversary gala. The bearer shares were airtight. I was the sole legal owner of Jeremiah Logistics. Yet here I was walking into a room funded by money that legally belonged to me. Crystal chandeliers cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm glow over designer gowns. Waiters in white gloves floated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne. I spotted my parents immediately holding court near an ice sculpture carved into their company logo. Brenda wore a sparkling emerald gown, while Jeremiah puffed a cigar, laughing loudly. They looked like royalty. I smoothed my simple black dress and stepped inside. I was halfway to the bar when I heard the sharp clacking of my mother's heels approaching. I turned just as Brenda intercepted me firmly, linking her arm through mine, with a grip so tight her sharp nails dug deep into my bare skin. She plastered on a fake smile and dragged me toward a group of wealthy socialites she had been trying to impress. The women turned to look at me, scanning my modest outfit with polite disdain. My mother projected her voice over the soft jazz playing in the background. She introduced me to the group, but before they could say hello, she delivered her calculated strike. She sighed dramatically and told them that Maya is currently between successes. She added with a condescending chuckle that I was living in her late mother's teardown in the West End, trying to figure out what to do with my life. The women offered tight, sympathetic smiles reserved for charity cases. My mother beamed, elevating her status by stepping directly on my dignity. A week ago, her words would have stung, but tonight, standing there with the knowledge of her impending ruin, I felt nothing. I simply smiled back, agreed the West End had potential, and extracted my arm. I calmly walked away without saying another single word, leaving Brenda looking completely confused by my total lack of reaction. Before she could pursue me, a loud chime echoed through the ballroom. Trent was standing on the main stage, tapping a spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The room quieted down as guests turned their attention to the front. Aaliyah stood next to him, wearing a glittering diamond necklace that caught the light. Trent cleared his throat and welcomed everyone to the celebration. He praised my parents for their marriage, but quickly pivoted to the real reason they had gathered such a massive crowd. He announced that he and Aaliyah had been working tirelessly to secure the future of Jeremiah Logistics. He paused for dramatic effect, letting anticipation build in the silent room. With a wide grin, he revealed they had signed a preliminary agreement for a $150 million merger with the Vanguard Group. The ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. People were cheering and raising their glasses in a toast to my family's brilliant business acumen. Aaliyah blew kisses to the crowd. My father stood near the stage, accepting handshakes from rival businessmen who looked at him with sheer envy. It was the crowning achievement of his life. There was only one massive problem. He was selling a company he did not legally own. The applause began to die down as the jazz band resumed playing a lively tune. Guests started migrating back toward the bar. My father remained standing near the edge of the stage, accepting congratulations from local politicians. I navigated through the crowd, my eyes fixed firmly on his broad shoulders. He did not see me approaching until I was standing right beside him. The politicians excused themselves, leaving my father and me alone. He looked down at me, the triumphant smile on his face quickly souring into a look of deep irritation. He leaned in and warned me not to ruin his night. He told me that if I was here to beg for a handout, I was wasting my time. I stood perfectly still, letting the surrounding noise of the party wash over us. Then I stepped closer, closing the distance between us so that only he could hear my next words. I looked directly into his eyes, keeping my voice soft, steady, and terrifyingly calm. I whispered that I found the 1985 bearer shares hidden under the floorboards of Grandma Ruby's house. I watched his breathing stop. I leaned in just a fraction closer, ensuring my words pierced right through his ego. I asked him how much Vanguard was paying for a company he did not legally own. The reaction was instantaneous. The color completely drained from my father's face, leaving him looking like a ghost under the bright chandelier lights. The expensive crystal glass he was holding slipped from his suddenly numb fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, explosive crash, sending shards of glass scattering across the ground. A few guests jumped at the noise, turning to look at us in surprise. My father did not notice them. His eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen in him before. He was looking at me not as a disappointment, but as an absolute threat. He knew exactly what those shares meant. He knew that the empire he had just bragged about selling belonged entirely to me. Panic began to visibly ripple through his body. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the fact that his perfect house of cards was about to collapse. He tore his gaze away from me and frantically scanned the crowded ballroom. He spotted Trent standing near the bar, laughing with a group of investors. My father did not hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing Trent by the arm with a desperate, crushing grip. He pulled his son-in-law close, his voice trembling with genuine fear as he whispered the command. "She knows. Destroy her." Monday morning hit with the kind of heavy, relentless rain that perfectly matched the mood of a looming corporate war. I walked into my regular coffee shop just down the street from my office building, feeling a strange sense of absolute calm. The events at the country club had ignited a fire in my family, but I felt nothing but ice-cold clarity. I ordered my usual black coffee and handed the barista my debit card. He swiped it through the machine, but it immediately beeped with an angry red light. He looked up apologetically and said it had been declined. I frowned slightly, pulling out my backup credit card and handing it over. The machine buzzed again. Declined. I offered a quiet apology to the line of people behind me, stepped to the side of the counter, and opened the banking application on my phone. A bright red banner flashed across the top of my screen warning me that my account had been frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity and instructing me to contact my branch administrator immediately. I did not panic. I immediately recognized the tactic for what it was. This was not a standard fraud alert triggered by an unusual purchase or a misplaced location pin. This was a hard lock, a full and deliberate asset freeze. My mind raced straight back to Trent and his smug, condescending face at the law office. As the chief financial officer of Jeremiah Logistics, he had deep, entrenched connections with elite banking executives all over Atlanta. He had pulled a massive favor. He had leveraged his corporate power to cut off my oxygen, assuming that stripping me of my cash would force me into immediate submission. They honestly thought I would panic cry and come crawling back to them. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket, paid for my coffee with a crumpled $5 bill, and walked out into the pouring rain, heading straight up to my office. I had barely hung up my wet coat and turned on my dual monitors when the heavy glass door of my office swung open. Aaliyah strutted in, completely ignoring the receptionist outside. She was dripping in designer labels, holding a cup of artisanal matcha tea, and wearing a smile so deeply toxic it could curdle milk. She did not bother to knock or close the door behind her. She simply leaned against the doorframe, admiring her freshly manicured nails with an air of absolute superiority. She asked how my morning was going, noting with a cruel little laugh that the rain must be terrible when you have to walk because your cards keep declining. I did not look up from my screens. I simply asked her what she wanted. She stepped further into my office, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She leaned heavily over my desk, invading my space, the scent of her overpowering perfume suffocating the small room. "You play with the big dogs, you get bitten," she said, her voice dripping with venom and unearned arrogance. "Give Dad the papers or you will be sleeping on the streets by Friday." She smiled widely, clearly waiting for me to break down. She wanted tears. She wanted me to beg for mercy. She told me that Dad was willing to be generous, that if I handed over the bearer shares today, he would lift the freeze on my accounts and maybe even throw a few $1,000s my way for my trouble. She looked around my modest office with pure disgust, adding that I clearly needed the money and that I was completely out of my depth. I slowly leaned back in my ergonomic chair and met her gaze. I did not blink, and I certainly did not flinch. I told her that she was wearing a lovely jacket, but she should probably check the stitching on the shoulder because it looked incredibly cheap. Aaliyah touched her lapel defensively, her perfect gloating smile slipping for just a fraction of a second. I pointed past her and told her the door was behind her and that she was currently blocking my view of the hallway. She sneered, her face twisting into an ugly mask of rage. She called me a pathetic loser who did not know when she was beaten. She spun on her heel and marched out, slamming the glass door so hard it rattled violently in its metal frame. As soon as she was gone, the real work began. They thought freezing my accounts was a brilliant checkmate move. What Trent and my father failed to realize is that a forensic accountant treats a financial freeze not as a locked door, but as a glowing digital fingerprint. Trent had used his elite banking connections to place that lock, which meant he had to file an executive override through a backdoor channel. An override of that magnitude always leaves a trail. I opened my heavily encrypted auditing software and bypassed the standard portals, logging directly into the Federal Public Registry database. I started pulling the raw metadata from my own banking alert, meticulously tracing the IP origin and the exact executive authorization code that had triggered the freeze. It took me 3 solid hours of relentless cross-referencing and code breaking. I traced the authorization back to a specific corporate banking liaison who exclusively managed upper-tier accounts for Jeremiah Logistics. Trent had illegally used company leverage to freeze my personal assets. But as I pulled the public financial filings for Jeremiah Logistics, running a standard algorithmic sweep to find the exact authorization chain he used, my software flagged a massive anomaly. It was a tiny discrepancy at first glance, a routing fraction that did not align with the company's standard payroll or vendor disbursements. I isolated the routing number and ran a deep background search through offshore corporate registries. The numbers on my screen began to cascade, linking to a hidden shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The company was registered under the name Vanguard Holdings Limited. It was a brilliant, devious trick using the name of the company they were currently trying to merge with to hide the entity in plain sight during corporate audits. I dug deeper, accessing international tax records and property deeds linked to that specific shell company. The puzzle pieces rapidly snapped into perfect clarity. Trent had not just frozen my accounts to protect my father. He had been systematically siphoning money from my father's empire for years. Line by line, the hidden ledgers revealed millions of dollars funneled out of Jeremiah Logistics and transferred straight into the offshore shell company. Trent was entirely in control of it. He was not just the arrogant son-in-law playing the loyal chief financial officer. He was actively embezzling massive amounts of corporate funds to finance a secret life of extreme wealth. And now I held the exact digital trail that could put him in federal prison for decades. My family wanted to starve me out and force me onto the streets, but in their arrogance, they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them from the inside out. I stared at the glowing screens of my monitors long after Aaliyah slammed the door. The digital trail of Trent's offshore shell company was securely backed up onto an encrypted external drive resting safely in my pocket. I had exactly what I needed to ruin my brother-in-law, but my family was not going to wait patiently for my next move. They were already striking back. Less than an hour after Aaliyah left my office, my desk phone rang. It was the receptionist telling me that the senior managing partner wanted to see me in his office immediately. His name was Mr. Sterling, a man who cared about billable hours, corporate relationships, and preserving the pristine reputation of our accounting firm above all else. My father was one of the most powerful men in Atlanta high society, and he knew exactly how to use his influence to get what he wanted. I walked down the long glass corridor of the firm, fully anticipating the ambush waiting for me behind the heavy oak doors of the corner office. When I walked in, Mr. Sterling was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. He did not offer me a seat. He turned around with a deeply uncomfortable expression and told me that he had just received a highly disturbing phone call from Jeremiah Logistics. He explained that my father had personally contacted the executive board and accused me of corporate espionage. According to my father, I was using the firm resources to illegally access their proprietary financial data to sabotage a pending $150 million merger with the Vanguard Group. Mr. Sterling looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe corporate detachment. He said that while my work here had been exceptional, the firm simply could not risk the liability of harboring an employee accused of federal corporate crimes by a major local empire. He slid a standard severance agreement across his polished mahogany desk and told me he was terminating my employment effective immediately. He suggested I pack my desk quietly to avoid any further embarrassment. I did not reach for the pen. I did not shed a single tear or beg for my job. I did not try to appeal to his emotions because I knew men like him only responded to leverage and risk. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. I placed it squarely on top of his termination papers. I told Mr. Sterling that he might want to sit down and review the contents before he made a decision that would legally implicate him in one of the largest corporate frauds in state history. He frowned, clearly insulted by my defiance, but his curiosity won. He sat down and opened the folder. Inside were dozens of pages of heavily redacted financial records. I had carefully blacked out the identifying account numbers, keeping the ultimate leverage to myself, but leaving just enough raw data visible to prove my point. I watched the color slowly drain from his face as his eyes scanned the ledgers. I calmly explained that my father was currently attempting to finalize a massive corporate merger with the Vanguard Group based on deeply falsified asset declarations. I told him that Jeremiah Logistics did not legally belong to my father because the original 1985 bearer shares had just been legally transferred to me. I let that truth sink into the silent room. I pointed to the documents and explained that if Mr. Sterling fired me now at the direct request of a man actively committing severe violations of the Securities and Exchange Commission, he and this entire accounting firm would instantly become accessories to federal wire fraud and illegal corporate restructuring. I told him that my father was using him to silence a whistleblower, and if the federal investigators knocked on the firm doors tomorrow, his signature on my termination papers would be the exact evidence they needed to charge him with obstruction of justice. Mr. Sterling stopped reading. His hands were actually trembling as he looked up at me. The arrogant managing partner was suddenly terrified of the junior forensic accountant standing in front of him. He was a man who lived by risk assessment, and he instantly recognized that crossing me meant walking straight into a federal prison cell. He slowly closed the folder and pushed the termination agreement into the trash can next to his desk. He cleared his throat, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, and told me that it appeared there had been a massive misunderstanding regarding my employment status. He said I was a highly valued member of the firm and that I should return to my desk and continue my important work without any further interruptions. He had backed down completely, becoming my silent ally, simply out of pure self-preservation. I thanked him politely, picked up my redacted file, and walked back to my office. My father had tried to sever my professional lifeline, and he had failed miserably. But simply surviving their attacks was no longer enough. It was time to go on the offensive. I sat down at my desk and pulled out a stack of blank, high-grade printer paper. I began printing the unredacted offshore banking records I had pulled earlier that morning. Page after page of absolute proof showing exactly how Trent had been embezzling millions of dollars from Jeremiah Logistics into his secret Cayman Islands account. I highlighted the massive daily transfers, the luxury car purchases hidden under corporate expenses, and the offshore real estate deeds filed under the fake Vanguard Shell Company. I placed the stack of papers into a thick brown courier envelope. I did not include a note. The numbers spoke loud enough on their own. I printed a shipping label addressing the package directly to Aaliyah's personal assistant at the corporate headquarters of Jeremiah Logistics. I knew her assistant sorted all of the incoming mail and handed my sister the most urgent documents directly during her morning meetings. I sealed the envelope with a piece of heavy tape. My family had spent my entire life trying to tear me down, united by their shared cruelty and greed. Now I was going to hand them the exact tools they needed to destroy each other. I dropped the package into the outgoing overnight mail bin. Aaliyah was about to find out that her perfect, brilliant husband was bleeding her family dry, and I was going to sit back and watch the villains tear each other apart. I spent the next 48 hours working from the sturdy oak dining table inside Grandma Ruby's house. I had fully moved my operation into the West End, transferring my encrypted servers and auditing software to my personal laptops. My father had failed to get me fired, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he realized that corporate intimidation was not going to work. He was a desperate man watching his empire crumble, and desperate men always resort to physical force when their money fails them. I just did not expect him to use the local authorities to do his dirty work. It was Wednesday evening, and the sun was just beginning to dip below the Atlanta skyline, casting long shadows across the dusty floorboards of the living room. I was reviewing the digital copies of the bearer shares when heavy fists began pounding violently against my front door. The entire house seemed to shake with the force of the blows. Before I could even stand up, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the hallway. The heavy deadbolt gave way with a loud crack, and the front door swung open, slamming against the interior wall. Two uniformed police officers stepped over the threshold, bringing the damp evening air in with them. They were large men with their hands resting intimidatingly on their duty belts. The taller officer stepped forward and announced himself as Officer Miller, while his partner, Officer Davis, kicked the broken pieces of my doorframe out of the way. Miller pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket and shoved it toward my chest. He told me that they were executing an immediate eviction order and a civil asset seizure warrant. He said the property was condemned due to structural hazards and that I had exactly 5 minutes to grab my personal belongings and vacate the premises. Davis did not wait for my response. He walked straight past me into the living room, his eyes scanning the floorboards. He walked directly toward the staircase, stopping right above the hidden Mosler floor safe. He looked at Miller and nodded, telling him that the target asset was right where the tip said it would be. My father had obviously sent them here with explicit instructions to seize the safe and retrieve the bearer shares before Vanguard realized the merger was a complete fraud. I did not panic. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and immediately opened my social media application. I tapped the screen to start a live video broadcast, pointing the camera directly at the two officers. I calmly informed them that they were currently streaming live to over 2,000 followers and that the video was automatically backing up to an off-site secure server. I looked down at the paper Miller had shoved at me. It looked official with a city seal and a barcode, but my forensic training made the flaws glaringly obvious. I kept the camera steady and told Officer Miller that the eviction notice lacked a valid judicial signature and the docket number printed at the top belonged to a closed traffic violation from 3 years ago. I informed him that presenting a forged civil asset warrant was a federal crime. Miller stepped toward me, raising his hand to block the camera lens. He demanded that I turn the phone off and leave the house before he arrested me for obstructing justice. He told me to stop playing games because I was out of my league. I did not back down. I zoomed in on his silver badge, capturing the numbers perfectly on the live stream. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that as a senior forensic accountant, I made it my business to track every single cent that left Jeremiah Logistics. I kept my voice perfectly level as I informed the officers that I knew my father had authorized 2 separate cash withdrawals of $50,000 yesterday afternoon. I told them I had spent my morning tracing those specific funds through a series of shell accounts. I read their badge numbers aloud to the camera. Then I recited the exact routing number of the offshore account in the Bahamas, where their bribe money had been deposited at 9 o'clock this morning. I told them that the transaction was flagged under a dummy consulting firm registered to Officer Davis's brother-in-law. I watched the blood drain from their faces as the reality of the situation crashed over them. I explained that I was submitting a comprehensive financial dossier to the Internal Affairs Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation detailing exactly how they were acting as paid mercenaries for a man actively committing securities fraud. Davis took a sudden step back away from the floor safe. He looked at Miller with pure panic in his eyes. They had expected a terrified young woman who would run away at the sight of a badge. They had not expected a financial auditor who had already tracked their illegal bribes across international borders. Miller lowered his hand and swallowed hard. He muttered something about a potential dispatch error and claimed they might be at the wrong address. He told Davis to fall back to the cruiser to verify the paperwork. They turned and practically ran out of my house, rushing down the porch steps and speeding away down the street without looking back. I ended the live stream and let out a long breath. The house was quiet again, but the cold evening wind was blowing through the shattered front door. I walked over to the entryway to inspect the damage. The wooden frame was completely splintered where Davis had kicked the lock. I knelt down and started picking up the broken pieces of wood, intending to board up the gap for the night. As I pried a large shard of the doorframe away from the wall, my fingers brushed against something thick and papery hidden inside the hollow cavity of the wall. I reached deeper into the dark space behind the plaster and pulled out a thick yellowed envelope wrapped entirely in heavy tape. It had been wedged perfectly behind the doorframe, hidden away for years. I carried the envelope over to the dining table and carefully sliced through the tape with a kitchen knife. I pulled out a stack of dense medical documents. They were Grandma Ruby's official health records from the months leading up to her death. I sat down and started reading the toxicology reports and physician notes. My grandmother had not simply died of old age or natural causes as my family had always claimed. The lab results clearly showed that her system was flooded with incredibly high doses of unprescribed digitalis and heavy sedatives during her final weeks. Someone had been systematically poisoning her. I stared at the clinical numbers on the page as a chilling realization washed over me. My father and Trent had not just stolen her company, they had murdered her to get it. The weight of the medical file in my hands felt heavier than concrete. I sat in the dusty silence of Grandma Ruby's living room, running my fingers over the highlighted toxicology results. Digitalis and heavy sedatives. These were not medications prescribed for a healthy, observant woman in her late 70s. This was a deliberate and calculated lethal dose. My family had not simply waited for her to pass away so they could steal the Jeremiah Logistics bearer shares and push through their massive Vanguard merger. They had actively accelerated the timeline. They had killed my grandmother. The financial crimes I had uncovered earlier that morning suddenly paled in comparison to the sheer monstrous reality of homicide. I felt a wave of nausea hit my stomach, followed instantly by a surge of pure, unbreakable rage. I was no longer just a forensic accountant fighting for my inheritance. I was a granddaughter seeking justice for blood. I knew my father was too much of a coward to face me himself after his hired police officers fled the scene. Trent was likely scrambling to hide his offshore tracks after the anonymous tip I sent to Aaliyah. That left only one person arrogant enough to think she could walk into this house and manipulate me into handing over the evidence. My mother, Brenda. I spent the early hours of Thursday morning preparing the living room for her inevitable arrival. I positioned my laptop on the mantelpiece, angling the screen slightly downward to capture the entire seating area. I opened a secure broadcasting application and synced the laptop camera directly to an encrypted cloud server. If they wanted to play a deadly game of corporate espionage, I was going to ensure every single move was recorded and preserved off-site. I brewed a fresh pot of herbal tea, remembering how much my mother loved to use hospitality as a weapon. Right on cue, a sleek silver luxury sedan pulled up to the curb at 10 o'clock in the morning. Brenda stepped out, carefully avoiding the puddles on the sidewalk in her designer heels. She wore a tailored beige suit and oversized sunglasses, looking utterly out of place in the historic West End. I watched through the front window as she navigated the broken porch steps and stepped through the splintered doorframe. She took off her sunglasses and plastered on a look of deep maternal concern. She told me she was so worried about me living in this dangerous environment. She sighed heavily, placing a bakery box on the table and claiming she had come to make peace. She said family should not fight over money, and that my father was just stressed about the business. She asked if we could sit down and talk like adults to figure out a compromise that worked for everyone. I played the part of the exhausted, overwhelmed daughter perfectly. I let my shoulders slump and offered her a weak nod. I told her I would go to the kitchen to fetch us some cups for the tea. I turned my back on her and walked through the swinging door, but I stopped right behind it, peering through the narrow crack near the hinges. I watched my mother drop the concerned parent act the very second she thought she was alone. Her eyes darted around the room before locking onto my leather briefcase resting on the coffee table. She moved with surprising speed for a woman in tight clothing, unzipping the main compartment and frantically shuffling through the folders inside. She was desperately searching for the bearer shares and the banking ledgers. I pushed the kitchen door open and stepped back into the living room. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the yellowed envelope I had found behind the broken door frame. I asked her if she was looking for this mom. Brenda froze, her hand still buried deep inside my briefcase. She slowly withdrew her arm, her perfectly contoured face tightening into a mask of cold panic as she recognized the hospital logo stamped on the outside of the envelope. I held up the toxicology report and told her I knew exactly what they had done. I told her the lab results proved Grandma Ruby was poisoned with massive doses of unprescribed medication in her final weeks. The polite society facade completely vanished from my mother's face. Her elegant posture morphed into something defensive and ugly. She took a step toward me, her voice rising to a frantic, shrill pitch. She shouted that I did not understand how the real world worked. She screamed that that stubborn old bat would not hand over the land or the company shares for the Vanguard deal, no matter how much they begged her. Brenda's chest heaved as she stepped closer, her manicured hands curled into tight fists. She confessed that they were about to lose $150 million, all because of one stubborn woman who refused to get out of the way of progress. She hissed that she just gave her a little extra sleeping medicine in her tea, so she would finally be compliant enough to sign the power of attorney documents. She glared at me with absolute justification, claiming that she did it for the family to secure our legacy and that I should be on my knees thanking her for making the hard choices. She insisted that Grandma Ruby was old and in the way, and that her sacrifice was necessary to elevate the family name to where it rightfully belonged. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the medical file from my hands, but I easily stepped out of her reach. I did not blink. I did not yell. I simply raised my hand and pointed directly at the laptop resting quietly on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. The small green light next to the webcam was glowing steadily in the dim room. I looked my mother in the eye and thanked her for the confession. I kept my voice perfectly calm as I informed her that the cloud recording had already been uploaded. Brenda stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her mouth hanging slightly open as she stared at the glowing green light on my laptop webcam. The realization that she had just confessed to a murder conspiracy on a live encrypted cloud recording completely broke her pristine facade. She did not scream or try to attack me again. She simply turned around and stumbled out of the house like a ghost, leaving her luxury leather handbag sitting forgotten on the floorboards. I watched through the window as she practically crawled into her silver sedan and drove away, knowing my father would be the next one to panic. But while my parents were dealing with the devastating fallout of their own destruction, the package I had overnighted to my sister was finally reaching its destination. I walked over to the mantelpiece and ended the cloud broadcast, securing the video file in 3 separate offshore data vaults. I sat back down at my workstation and pulled up a hidden terminal on my second monitor. When I was running my initial forensic audits on the Jeremiah Logistics executive accounts weeks ago, I had taken the liberty of planting a simple audio surveillance bug inside the smart home network of Trent and Aaliyah's luxury downtown penthouse. It was a basic security precaution that was about to pay off immensely. I slipped my noise-canceling headphones over my ears and listened to the crisp audio feed streaming directly from their sprawling living room. Aaliyah had just arrived home from the corporate headquarters. Her personal assistant had handed her the thick brown envelope right after her morning meetings, exactly as I had planned. I could hear the heavy thud of her designer briefcase hitting the marble kitchen counter, followed by the loud tearing of thick shipping tape. There was a long, heavy silence on the audio feed as my sister began to pull out the unredacted offshore banking records. I heard the frantic rustling of paper as she flipped through page after page of absolute, undeniable proof. She was looking at the massive daily cash transfers, the luxury car purchases, and the offshore real estate deeds, all funded by money embezzled directly from our family empire into her husband's secret Cayman Islands accounts. The numbers painted a picture of a man who had been bleeding her dry from the very first day of their marriage. Trent walked into the kitchen a few minutes later. I could hear his heavy footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, and his falsely cheerful voice asking his beautiful wife how her day was going. He was playing the role of the perfect, woke, supportive white husband, flawlessly, completely unaware that the trap had already sprung. Aaliyah did not greet him. Her voice was shaking with a volatile mixture of disbelief and absolute fury when she asked him why there was a Vanguard shell company registered in his personal name holding $20 million of Jeremiah Logistics capital. The cheerful act dropped instantly. A vicious screaming match erupted in the penthouse so loud it made me wince through my headphones. Aaliyah demanded answers, screaming about betrayal and throwing the heavy stack of banking records across the room. Trent did not try to deny the evidence or beg for forgiveness. He knew he was caught, and instead of showing remorse, he unleashed his true nature. The progressive, supportive facade he had worn for years melted away, revealing the arrogant, condescending predator beneath. He yelled back at her, telling her she was being hysterical and deeply ungrateful. He said that her entire family was incompetent, and that Jeremiah Logistics would have gone bankrupt years ago if he had not stepped in to manage their chaotic financial structure. I listened closely as Trent completely lost control of his temper. His voice dripped with racist superiority and deep-seated venom as he told my sister that you people would be absolutely nothing without his financial structuring. He shouted that he took what he was owed for putting up with her arrogant family and saving their crumbling legacy from total ruin. He told Aaliyah that she was just an empty figurehead, a diversity token playing chief executive officer, while he did all the real heavy lifting behind the scenes. He mocked her intelligence, telling her she was too stupid to even notice the money disappearing right under her nose. The silence that followed his cruel outburst was deafening. Aaliyah had spent her entire life believing she was the brilliant golden child of the family, superior to me in every single way. Now she was standing in her luxury penthouse realizing her perfect marriage was an absolute sham, and her brilliant husband had played her for a complete fool. Her voice was deadly quiet when she told him to get out of her house. Trent let out a cold, mocking laugh and told her that half of everything they owned belonged to him anyway, including the company. The heavy front door slammed shut a moment later, leaving my sister alone with the devastating ruins of her perfectly curated life. I took off my headphones, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. My sister was finally experiencing the profound betrayal and humiliation she had inflicted on me for years. But my satisfaction was incredibly short-lived because I knew Aaliyah too well. She was a ruthless survivor who cared about her public reputation and her wealth above all else. She was not going to sit around crying over a broken marriage while federal investigators closed in on the missing millions. She needed a scapegoat to save herself from impending corporate ruin and federal prison. I watched the digital activity logs on the company's server suddenly light up on my monitor. Aaliyah was logging into the Jeremiah Logistics financial database using her master executive credentials. She was rapidly accessing the very same accounts Trent had used to embezzle the money. But she was not freezing the assets or flagging them for an internal investigation. She was actively altering the digital authorization signatures, changing Trent's user identification codes to match my old forensic accounting employee login credentials. She was fabricating a digital trail of documents to make it look like I was the one who had drained the corporate accounts. My sister was going to frame me for her husband's massive financial crimes and rush straight to the police to save her own skin. I sat in the cold metal chair of the precinct interrogation room. The walls were painted a sickly shade of industrial gray, and the air smelled heavily of stale coffee and floor cleaner. Directly across from me was a massive mirror stretching across the entire wall. I knew exactly how two-way glass worked, and I knew exactly who was standing on the other side. My father Jeremiah and my sister Aaliyah were undoubtedly standing in the dark observation room watching me. They were probably smirking and congratulating themselves on their brilliant strategy. Aaliyah had thought she could save her own skin by throwing me to the wolves. She had rushed to the police with fabricated evidence, hoping to frame me for the exact crimes her husband had committed. The heavy steel door clicked open, and a weary-looking detective walked into the small room. He dropped a massive stack of printed financial ledgers onto the metal table between us. The loud thud echoed sharply in the quiet space. He sat down heavily across from me and introduced himself as Detective Russo. He did not offer a friendly smile or a polite greeting. He looked at me with the tired, annoyed expression of a man who thought he had already solved the case and just wanted a quick confession. He tapped his index finger against the top folder and told me that my sister had just provided the department with absolute proof of my crimes. Detective Russo explained that the documents clearly showed my employee identification codes attached to dozens of illegal wire transfers. He said the corporate records indicated I had been systematically draining millions of dollars from Jeremiah Logistics into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands over the last 6 months. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the scratched metal table, and suggested that I make things easy on myself. He said that if I confessed right now, he would personally speak to the district attorney about leniency. He told me that corporate embezzlement of this magnitude carried a 20-year federal prison sentence. He tried to play the sympathetic cop, telling me I was far too young to throw my entire life away for money. I did not panic. I did not break down in tears or beg for mercy. I looked directly at the two-way mirror, offering a cold, calculating smile to the invisible family members I knew were watching. Then I turned my attention back to the detective. I calmly reached down to the floor and unclasped my leather briefcase. I told Detective Russo that I deeply appreciated his concern for my future, but he was currently looking at forged documents. I asked him if his cybercrimes division had bothered to verify the digital footprints of the files my sister had so eagerly handed over. I watched his brow furrow in genuine confusion as I explained the concept of file metadata. I told him that if he ran a simple diagnostic check on those specific digital ledgers, he would see that they were not created months ago during the alleged bank transfers. I kept my voice perfectly level and informed him that those files were generated exactly at 11 o'clock last night. I let that undeniable fact hang in the cold air of the interrogation room. I added that the Internet Protocol address attached to the creation of those files did not belong to my computer or my office. I told him it belonged to the luxury downtown penthouse owned by Trent and Aaliyah. I explained that my sister had panicked and spent her entire night fabricating a digital trail to frame me for her husband's massive financial crimes. Detective Russo stopped tapping his finger against the table. He sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he processed my words. I did not give him time to recover from the shock. I pulled a thick, neatly bound dossier from my briefcase and pushed it across the metal table until it rested right next to his stack of forged papers. I told him that I was a senior forensic auditor and that I did not deal in sloppy amateur cover-ups. I explained that the file I just gave him contained a pristine, airtight forensic audit of the entire Jeremiah Logistics corporate network. I instructed him to open the file. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before flipping open the heavy cover. I walked him through the numbers as his eyes scanned the detailed pages. I pointed out the original unedited transfer logs, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that Trent was the one funneling the corporate capital into his own Vanguard shell company. I showed him the exact routing numbers, the hidden offshore accounts, and the luxury purchases Trent had made using stolen family money. But I did not stop there because my father needed to pay for his sins as well. I told the detective to look at the second section of the audit. I explained that my father Jeremiah had actively signed off on every single falsified asset declaration to artificially inflate the company valuation before the impending merger. I detailed how my father had systematically bribed local police officers to harass me and attempt an illegal seizure of my property. I even provided the offshore routing numbers where those specific police bribes had been deposited, showing the deep corruption that stretched across the city. Detective Russo stopped breathing for a moment. the color completely drained from his weathered face as he stared at the undeniable federal crimes documented flawlessly in front of him. This was no longer a simple family embezzlement dispute. This was a massive corporate conspiracy involving police corruption, wire fraud, and money laundering. He slowly closed the dossier. He stood up from the metal table without saying a single word to me. He walked over to the heavy steel door, but before he opened it, he turned and looked directly at the two-way mirror. He reached out and pressed the intercom button on the wall. His voice was grim and absolute as he spoke into the microphone, looking right at the spot where he knew my father was standing. He told Jeremiah that he was not permitted to leave the building. I knew money was a powerful shield in Atlanta, but I severely underestimated just how deeply my father's corruption ran through the city. Detective Russo had every intention of holding him in that precinct, but within an hour, the heavy doors of the interrogation room swung open and a team of high-priced corporate defense attorneys marched inside. My father had pulled every political string he had left, calling in favors from the police commissioner and the district attorney's office. They managed to temporarily suppress the arrest warrants, citing procedural errors and claiming the forensic audit needed to be verified by an independent third party. It was a desperate, heavily bribed delay tactic. My father had purchased himself exactly 24 hours of freedom. He knew the federal authorities were closing in, and his only chance of surviving the fallout was to push through the Vanguard merger, get the massive cash injection, and use the corporate funds to bury the investigation. The official signing gala was scheduled for the very next evening at the Ritz-Carlton Ballroom. It was supposed to be the crowning achievement of the Jeremiah logistics empire the moment my father legitimized his stolen legacy. I knew he would try to proceed as if nothing had happened. He was a cornered animal functioning on pure hubris, and Vanguard was his only escape route. But I was not going to let him sell a company that belonged to the woman he murdered. I spent the afternoon preparing my final strike. I bypassed my usual muted corporate wardrobe and chose a stunning power red designer suit. It was the color of absolute authority, the color of blood, and a glaring warning to everyone in the room that I was no longer the quiet, invisible daughter they could push around in the shadows. I packed the original physical bearer shares into my briefcase along with a flash drive containing the high-resolution digital scans. When I arrived at the hotel, the ballroom was already packed with Atlanta's corporate, elite, wealthy politicians and high society socialites. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over towering ice sculptures and tables dripping with expensive champagne and caviar. I walked past the velvet ropes without an invitation, projecting a level of absolute confidence that made the event staff immediately step aside. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the low hum of classical music and networking washed over me. I stepped into the ballroom, and the vibrant red of my suit immediately drew eyes from across the crowded room. Whispers began to ripple through the wealthy guests as people recognized the disgraced daughter who had supposedly been fired for corporate espionage just days ago. My mother Brenda was standing near the front of the room holding a delicate flute of champagne and laughing loudly with a group of senior Vanguard executives. She was playing the role of the perfect supportive matriarch flawlessly, but the moment she spotted me through the crowd, her artificial smile vanished instantly. I watched her perfectly manicured hand tighten around the crystal stem of her glass until her knuckles turned bone white. She remembered the webcam. She knew I had her recorded confession about Grandma Ruby. Brenda immediately set her drink down on a passing waiter's tray and began frantically signaling to the private security guards stationed near the stage, pointing discreetly in my direction with a trembling finger. Two large men in dark suits immediately broke away from their posts and began weaving through the crowded tables toward me. I did not give them the chance to intercept me. I moved with purposeful speed, bypassing the slow-moving guests and making a direct line for the main presentation stage. My father was standing at the podium, shaking hands with the lead Vanguard representative, preparing to give his opening remarks before the formal signing of the contracts. Aaliyah was standing just behind him, looking completely hollowed out and terrified, trying to maintain her posture while her fake marriage and fabricated career crumbled around her. My father froze mid-handshake when he saw me climbing the short carpeted steps to the stage. His face went completely pale, and the arrogant posture he had maintained for decades seemed to instantly evaporate under the bright stage lights. I walked right past him, not even granting him the dignity of a glance, and firmly grabbed the microphone from the center of the wooden podium. The sharp feedback whine of the microphone echoed through the massive ballroom, bringing the entire gala to a sudden and dead silence. Hundreds of faces turned upward, staring at me in absolute shock. I looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, corrupt politicians, and my terrified family members, and I smiled. I told the silent room that I would like to make a toast to my father. I kept my voice loud and unwavering, ensuring it carried to the very back of the hall. I called him a man of unparalleled ambition, a man who built a massive transportation empire on a $30 foundation. I reached into the pocket of my red blazer and pulled out the small remote for the room's audiovisual system, which I had discreetly acquired from the sound technician 5 minutes earlier. I pressed the main button and the lights in the ballroom suddenly dimmed. The massive presentation screen behind me flickered to life. Instead of the polished Jeremiah Logistics corporate logo, the screen was instantly filled with a crisp, high-definition image of the original 1985 bearer shares. The delicate scrollwork, the official state seals, and the undeniable legal transfer stamps showing my name were magnified 10 feet tall for every single investor to see. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The Vanguard executives sitting in the front row dropped their glasses, staring up at the screen in pure, unadulterated shock. They were brilliant financial minds, and they instantly recognized that they were about to spend $150 million purchasing a stolen company from a man who had zero legal authority to sell it. My father lunged toward the podium, his face twisted in desperate rage, trying to rip the microphone from my hands, but he was too late. I stepped back, keeping my eyes locked entirely on the Vanguard representatives. I spoke clearly and definitively into the microphone. As the sole legal owner of Jeremiah Logistics, I am canceling this merger. The silence in the ballroom lasted only a fraction of a second before the entire room erupted into absolute chaos. The collective shock of 300 wealthy investors and socialites transformed instantly into a deafening roar of confusion and panic. I watched the lead Vanguard executives jump out of their front row seats, their faces flushed with anger as they demanded immediate answers. My mother dropped her champagne glass entirely, letting the crystal shatter against the polished marble floor. The carefully curated illusion of the Jeremiah family empire was disintegrating in real time right in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. I stood perfectly still behind the wooden podium, letting the massive projection of the bearer shares shine brightly behind me. My father could not handle the public humiliation. The polite corporate mask he had worn for decades completely melted away, revealing the violent, desperate man underneath. His face turned a deep, mottled purple, and the veins bulged against his neck as he let out a furious scream. He lunged across the stage, completely ignoring the stunned Vanguard representatives standing just feet away. He charged directly at me, with his hands outstretched, looking like he wanted to wrap his fingers around my throat and strangle me in front of hundreds of witnesses. I did not flinch or back away in fear. I simply waited until he was inches away and then effortlessly sidestepped his clumsy attack. My father was blinded by his own rage and unable to stop his forward momentum. He crashed heavily into the wooden podium, knocking it over and tumbling awkwardly to the carpeted floor. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as Atlanta high society watched a billionaire patriarch sprawl across the stage like a common street thug. Before my father could scramble back to his feet, Trent rushed up the side stairs of the stage. He was desperately trying to do damage control and salvage the merger that would save him from federal prison. He completely ignored his father-in-law struggling on the floor and stepped directly to the edge of the stage to face the furious Vanguard executives. He raised his hands in a placating gesture and pasted on his signature arrogant smile. He raised his voice over the murmuring crowd and told the investors that there was no need to panic. He blatantly lied and claimed that the documents on the screen were clever digital fabrications. He told the entire ballroom that I was deeply mentally unstable and suffering from a severe psychological breakdown following the tragic death of my grandmother. He spun a pathetic story about my unhinged grief, making me a danger to myself and the company. He pleaded with the executives to ignore my hysterical outburst and proceed with the signing to secure their mutual financial future. I did not waste my breath arguing with a desperate cornered thief. I simply reached back into the pocket of my red designer suit and pulled out my smartphone. I had already synced my device to the ballroom audiovisual system when I hijacked the projector. I navigated to my encrypted cloud drive and selected the audio file I had recorded from Trent and Aalia's penthouse earlier that morning. I turned the master volume to its maximum setting and pressed play. The crisp, high-definition audio of Trent's voice boomed through the massive concert speakers mounted around the ballroom. Every single guest in the room heard him screaming at Aalia with absolute venom. They heard the undeniable racist disgust in his voice as he told her that her family would be nothing without his financial structuring. They heard him explicitly brag about embezzling $20 million into a secret Vanguard shell company. The most damning moment came when his recorded voice echoed through the venue, calling his wife a diversity token and an empty figurehead, while he managed the stolen corporate capital. The color instantly drained from Trent's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He scrambled backward, stumbling over the microphone cord as he looked around the ballroom. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were staring at him with absolute disgust. Aalia was standing near the front tables, shaking uncontrollably as she listened to her husband humiliate her in front of her peers and business associates. Her perfect life was entirely destroyed in a matter of seconds. The silence that fell over the room after the audio finished playing was heavier and darker than before. It was the silence of complete corporate execution. The Vanguard chief executive officer stepped forward from the crowd. He buttoned his suit jacket with a sharp, angry motion and looked up at my father, who had finally managed to pull himself up from the floor. The executive did not bother hiding his contempt. He told my father that Vanguard was a respected global institution that did not conduct business with criminals. He stated with absolute finality that my father was a liability and a massive fraud. He declared that the merger was officially canceled and that their legal team would be pursuing damages for the deception. The Vanguard CEO turned his back on my father and signaled for his team of executives to leave the gala. The group of powerful men and women marched in unison down the center aisle of the ballroom, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind them. I watched from the stage as the hotel staff rushed to pull open the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall to let the furious investors out. But as the doors swung wide open, the Vanguard team abruptly stopped in their tracks. They stepped aside as a large group of men and women, wearing dark tactical windbreakers, flooded into the opulent ballroom. The bright yellow letters spelling FBI were printed clearly across their backs. The federal agents marched directly through the parted crowd, heading straight for the stage. The lead agent held up a thick stack of warrants bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. The sheer panic radiating from my father and Trent was intoxicating to witness. They had spent their entire lives believing their money and their connections made them completely untouchable. They had murdered my grandmother and stolen my inheritance, assuming I would just quietly disappear into the background. They were incredibly wrong. The agents quickly surrounded the podium and placed their hands on their holstered weapons, ensuring there would be no more desperate escape attempts tonight. I stood tall in my power red suit, holding the authentic bearer shares tightly in my hand as the handcuffs were pulled out. My revenge was finally absolute and the empire was legally mine again. The lead federal agent stepped up onto the stage and walked straight past my father, who was still frozen in absolute shock. The agent locked his eyes entirely on Trent. The sharp metallic sound of the handcuffs ratcheting open echoed clearly through the silent ballroom. The agent announced that Trent was under arrest for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and severe violations of the Securities and Exchange Commission regulations. The agent began reciting the Miranda rights, reading them aloud so every single wealthy investor in the room could hear exactly what kind of criminal had been running Jeremiah Logistics. Trent completely lost his mind. The polished, confident financial mastermind persona that he had perfected over the years shattered into a million pieces. His face flushed a violent shade of red, and a thick layer of sweat broke out across his forehead. He took a step backward, knocking over a floral arrangement as the two federal agents moved to flank him. He shoved his hands out in front of him, shaking his head frantically and insisting there was a massive mistake. He claimed that the funds were just temporarily relocated for international tax purposes and that he was completely innocent. When the agents ignored his pathetic lies, grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back, Trent squealed like a cornered animal. The heavy silver bracelets clicked securely around his wrists, binding him to the reality he had tried so hard to outrun. He realized in that exact moment that his pristine life of luxury cars, offshore bank accounts, and expensive tailored suits was over forever, and he would be spending the next 2 decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Instead of accepting his fate quietly, Trent turned into a complete coward. He twisted his neck around and scanned the ballroom, desperately looking for a way out of the trap. His eyes landed on my sister, who was standing near the front tables, shivering in her expensive designer gown. Trent pointed a trembling finger directly at Aaliyah and started screaming at the top of his lungs. He shouted that she knew everything about the missing money and the hidden Cayman Island ledgers. He yelled to the federal agents that Aaliyah was the chief executive officer and that she had personally signed every single one of the fraudulent wire transfers. He screamed that he was just a consultant following her direct orders, and that she was the real mastermind behind the entire corporate theft. He was throwing his own wife completely under the bus, without a single second of hesitation, just to save his own skin. The crowd of wealthy Atlanta socialites murmured in absolute horror, watching a marriage dissolve into a vicious criminal blame game. Aaliyah stumbled backward, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically shot. The progressive, supportive husband she had defended and elevated above her own family was openly offering her up to federal authorities to secure his own plea deal. 2 more agents broke away from the main group and walked down the steps of the stage, heading directly toward my sister. Aaliyah's breath hitched in her throat, and thick, dark tears of mascara began streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked toward our father, begging him silently for some kind of miraculous intervention. But Jeremiah was already in handcuffs with his head bowed, completely ignoring her existence to wallow in his own profound defeat. Aaliyah realized she had absolutely no one left in her corner. The sycophants and corporate climbers who usually surrounded her were physically backing away, refusing to be associated with a pending federal indictment. She turned her tear-filled eyes toward the stage and looked right at me. The absolute terror and desperate realization on her face was deeply satisfying after all the years of emotional abuse she had inflicted on me. She took a stumbling step forward toward the podium and raised her trembling hands in my direction. Her voice cracked and wailed as she begged me to intervene. She cried out, telling me that we were sisters and that family was supposed to protect each other no matter what. She pleaded with me not to let the federal agents take her away, saying she would surrender all her assets and do anything I wanted if I just told them to stop the arrest. I stood on the stage looking down at the woman who had spent her entire life making me feel completely worthless. I thought about the freezing rain outside the airport the night my husband died, when I had begged her for a simple ride home, and she had callously dismissed my pain to attend a social dinner. I thought about how she had tried to frame me for her own husband's financial crimes just hours ago, actively plotting to send me to a federal prison to secure her own freedom. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. I looked at my sister with absolute coldness, my face an unreadable mask of pure ice. I leaned toward the microphone that was still resting on the tilted wooden podium so that my voice would project perfectly across the silent, expansive ballroom. "Try calling an Uber," I said, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. "Why did not you plan better?" The exact words she had texted me on the worst day of my life now echoed loudly through the massive luxury venue, sealing her ultimate fate. Aaliyah let out a devastating, breathless sob as the federal agents firmly grabbed her arms and placed the heavy steel cuffs around her wrists. She collapsed to her knees in her elegant gown, completely unable to support her own weight, but the agents simply hauled her back up by her shoulders without any gentle consideration. The heavy oak ballroom doors were held wide open as the federal agents began to march my family out of the building. Trent was dragged down the main center aisle, first screaming and cursing wildly at anyone who would look at him. His expensive shoes scuffed against the thick carpet as he struggled pointlessly against the agent's grip. Aaliyah followed right behind him, weeping hysterically and stumbling over her high heels, her head hanging low in absolute public disgrace. Jeremiah brought up the rear, walking with a stiff, awkward shuffle as the reality of his destroyed legacy and imminent incarceration finally sank into his corrupt mind. The elite members of Atlanta high society watched in total silence as the once powerful Jeremiah family was paraded through the center of the room in matching silver bracelets. Camera flashes suddenly erupted from the back of the hall as local journalists and society reporters frantically snapped pictures of the unprecedented and humiliating downfall. The corrupt empire they had built on lies was finally swept clean, and I stood on the stage entirely alone, ready to build a legacy that actually mattered. The ballroom emptied out completely, leaving me standing alone on the stage in the quiet aftermath of the Jeremiah family destruction. The federal freeze on the company assets was immediate and absolute. Within 24 hours, the news of the massive corporate arrests had completely saturated every local television channel and financial news outlet in the country. Aaliyah and Trent were sitting in separate federal holding cells, stripped of their expensive designer clothes and their arrogant pride. My father was locked away in a high-security detention center, watching his precious legacy turn into a nationwide scandal. I left the luxury hotel and returned to Grandma Ruby's house in the historic West End, letting the profound silence of the old wooden floors bring me a deep and settling comfort. The dark, heavy storm clouds that had been gathering over Atlanta all week finally broke that evening, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the front yard into a thick layer of slick mud. I was sitting in the living room drinking a warm cup of herbal tea when I heard the frantic pounding on the heavy front door. I set my mug down on the coffee table and walked slowly through the dark hallway. I did not bother turning on the porch light when I pulled the heavy wooden door open. Brenda was standing on the top step, looking completely unrecognizable. The pristine, tailored beige suits and perfectly coiffed hair were entirely gone. She was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing rain. Her expensive makeup ran down her face in dark, ugly streaks, making her look like a hollowed-out ghost. The reality of the frozen corporate estate and the sight of her golden child being dragged away in silver bracelets had completely shattered her carefully crafted high society persona. She did not try to maintain her usual air of maternal superiority or condescending grace. The moment I opened the door, my mother let out a loud, pathetic sob and collapsed forward. She missed the top step entirely and fell hard onto her knees right into the thick, dark mud flooding the front walkway. The freezing rain beat down on her back as she looked up at me from the dirt. She raised her trembling hands and begged me to help her. Her voice cracked as she screamed over the sound of the pouring storm, telling me that she was my mother and that I had to show some mercy. She pleaded with me to give my father the company back so he could pay the massive federal fines and bail Aaliyah out of jail. She sobbed uncontrollably, offering to take the entire blame for Grandma Ruby's death. She promised me that she would willingly go to prison for the unprescribed medicine and the poison if I would just save the family from absolute financial ruin. I stood perfectly still on the dry covered porch, looking down at the pathetic woman groveling in the mud. I felt absolutely no sympathy for the tears streaming down her ruined face. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant comparisons, and the way she had actively participated in my grandmother's murder just to secure a corporate merger. I did not reach out to help her up or offer her a dry towel. I simply looked down at her with cold, empty eyes. My voice was completely devoid of emotion when I finally spoke over the sound of the rain. I told her that she did not come here for me, and that she did not care about my well-being at all. I said she only came here crying because she was terrified of losing her Rolex watches and her exclusive country club memberships. I kept my tone perfectly steady as I looked her in the eye and told her that she did not have a family. Brenda, she had a brand, and that brand just went completely bankrupt. Brenda stopped sobbing and stared up at me, her eyes wide with total devastation. She finally realized that the obedient, quiet daughter she had pushed around for years was completely gone, and there was absolutely no manipulation left that would save her. She opened her mouth to beg one last time, but I did not let her speak. I reached inside the front pocket of my thick cardigan and pulled out a heavy folded paper sealed inside a waterproof plastic sleeve. I tossed it casually down the steps, watching it land right in the mud next to her trembling knees. I told her she would not have to volunteer to go to jail to save my father because the district attorney had already made that decision for her. I stepped back into the dry warmth of the hallway as she reached down with shaking fingers to pick up the plastic sleeve. I pulled the heavy front door shut, locking it securely and leaving her entirely alone in the freezing storm to read her official police summons for elder abuse and first-degree manslaughter. The next morning, the freezing rain from the storm had completely washed away, leaving the Atlanta skyline clear and incredibly bright. I did not bother wearing one of my muted corporate outfits. I chose a sharp-tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute authority, and I drove straight to the gleaming glass skyscraper that housed the corporate headquarters of Jeremiah Logistics. The federal authorities had spent the night verifying the original bearer shares and processing my digital backups. Once the forensic accountants confirmed that I was the sole legal owner of the entire empire, the Department of Justice granted me immediate full executive control. The massive federal freeze that had paralyzed the company overnight was lifted the moment my ownership was legally cemented. The company was officially mine, and I was walking into that building to clean out the rot once and for all. When I stepped through the revolving glass doors of the massive lobby, the entire atmosphere of the building shifted. The usual hum of arrogant executives and bustling assistants came to a dead halt. Hundreds of employees stopped what they were doing and stared at me in absolute stunned silence. They had all seen the evening news. They had watched the high-definition footage of their untouchable chief financial officer and their highly decorated chief executive officer being dragged out of the Ritz-Carlton in handcuffs. They knew exactly who I was, and they knew I was no longer the invisible, quiet daughter working in the basement archives. I walked straight past the front desk without checking in and headed directly for the private executive elevator, a space I had been strictly forbidden from using my entire life. The heavy steel doors opened onto the top floor, revealing the sprawling mahogany suite that my father had occupied for over 20 years. The receptionist sitting outside the massive double doors was trembling as she looked up at me. She stammered that Mr. Jeremiah was inside, but that he had given strict orders not to be disturbed by anyone. She told me that he had locked the heavy oak doors from the inside and was refusing to answer the intercom. My father had managed to post a massive cash bail late last night using the last of his personal offshore accounts to avoid sleeping in a federal holding cell. He had rushed straight to the corporate office in the middle of the night, like a cornered rat trying to hide the evidence of his lifelong deception before the FBI could return with a search warrant for his personal files. I did not say a word to the terrified receptionist. I simply walked up to the heavy oak doors and grabbed the brass handle. It was locked tight. My father had literally barricaded himself inside the CEO suite of a company he no longer owned. He was functioning on pure frantic desperation, trying to salvage whatever tiny fragments of his stolen empire he could. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the heavy metallic master key that the head of building security had handed me downstairs just 5 minutes earlier. I slid the key into the brass lock and turned it, hearing the heavy deadbolt slide back with a satisfying heavy click. I pushed the double doors wide open and stepped into the sprawling corner office. The air inside was thick and suffocating, smelling strongly of nervous sweat and burnt paper. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city were completely covered by heavy automated blinds, plunging the room into artificial shadows. My father was standing behind his massive custom-built mahogany desk, looking like a deranged madman. His expensive tailored suit jacket was discarded on the floor. His tie was completely undone, and his eyes were wild and bloodshot from lack of sleep. He was frantically shoving thick stacks of sensitive financial ledgers, offshore banking files, and forged property deeds into a heavy-duty industrial paper shredder. The machine was whining and grinding loudly, struggling to chew through the massive volumes of evidence he was trying to desperately destroy. He froze the moment he saw me standing in the doorway. The thick stack of papers in his hand slipped from his trembling fingers and scattered across the plush carpet. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, and he slammed his fists down on the mahogany desk. "You destroyed my legacy!" he screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with desperate fury. "You ruined everything. I built you. Ungrateful little witch. I made this family what it is, and you tore it all down in a single night." I walked slowly across the expensive carpet, completely unfazed by his violent screaming. I stepped directly behind the desk and reached down to the wall outlet, pulling the heavy black power cord of the industrial shredder straight out of the socket. The whining, grinding noise of the machine spun down into total, dead silence, leaving only the sound of his heavy, panicked breathing echoing in the dark room. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression completely blank and devoid of any daughterly affection. "No, Dad. I reclaimed Grandma's legacy," I said, my voice perfectly steady and sharp. "You were just the middleman who got greedy." My father opened his mouth to shout another threat, but the words completely died in his throat when I reached under the desk and pulled out an empty cardboard file box. I slammed the cardboard box down right in the center of his pristine mahogany desk, pushing aside his expensive gold nameplate. "Pack your things," I told him, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You have exactly 5 minutes before security physically removes you from my building." He stared at the empty box and then looked up at me, realizing that his absolute reign of terror was officially and permanently over. The crushing reality of his total defeat finally broke him. His shoulders slumped forward, and the arrogant posture he had maintained his entire life simply evaporated. His hands shook violently as he reached out and blindly dropped a single framed photograph and a few personal pens into the cardboard box. He could not even look at me as he picked up the pathetic little box and began the long, humiliating walk toward the office door. I followed closely behind him, making sure he did not touch a single company file or computer terminal on his way out. We walked out of the executive suite and stepped into the private elevator, riding down to the main lobby in absolute suffocating silence. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, the entire building's security team was waiting. They fell in step behind us, escorting the disgraced former patriarch across the polished marble lobby in front of hundreds of whispering employees who had gathered to watch his downfall. My father kept his head down, clutching his small cardboard box like a shield against the public humiliation. The security guards pushed open the heavy front glass doors, forcing him out onto the bright sunlit corporate plaza. My father stopped dead in his tracks the moment he stepped onto the pavement. He dropped his cardboard box, letting his few personal items scatter across the concrete. Parked along the front curb of the building were the 3 custom-ordered luxury company cars he had illegally purchased using stolen corporate funds. They were not waiting to drive him home. Instead, three massive, heavy-duty repo trucks were currently backing up and securing heavy steel towing chains to the axles of his beloved luxury fleet, completely repossessing the final symbols of his fabricated wealth that I had ordered towed away. The drive to the county detention center took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing into an entirely different dimension. The gleaming glass and steel of the downtown corporate district faded away, replaced by endless rows of gray concrete razor wire and heavily fortified security checkpoints. I parked my car in the visitor lot and walked through the bleak entrance, feeling the heavy, sterile air of the facility press down on me. After surrendering my belongings and passing through a series of invasive metal detectors, I was escorted down a long, windowless corridor painted in a dull, institutional green. The guard led me into a narrow visitation room, split down the middle by a thick wall of smudged bulletproof glass. I sat on a hard metal stool bolted to the linoleum floor and waited. A few minutes later, a heavy steel door on the other side of the glass clanked open. I watched as an armed guard escorted my sister into the room. Aaliyah looked absolutely unrecognizable. The polished, sophisticated woman who had spent her entire life draped in pure silk and custom designer labels was completely gone. In her place stood a fragile, terrified shell of a person, wearing a stiff, oversized, bright orange jumpsuit that swallowed her small frame. Her perfectly highlighted hair was dull and tangled, pulled back into a messy knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was completely bare of the expensive cosmetics she used to wear like armor, exposing the deep purple shadows of exhaustion under her terrified eyes. She walked with a slight shuffle, her shoulders hunched forward, looking smaller and more pathetic than I had ever seen her. She sat down on the stool opposite me and stared through the thick glass. Her hands were trembling violently as she reached up and grabbed the heavy black telephone receiver from the wall. I picked up my own receiver and held it to my ear, listening to the shaky, ragged sound of her breathing coming through the static-filled line. The moment our eyes met, Aaliyah burst into tears. It was not the quiet, dignified weeping she used to perform at charity galas to garner sympathy. It was a messy, desperate sobbing that contorted her entire face. She pressed her free hand against the glass and begged me to help her. Her voice was thin and raspy as she complained about the freezing temperatures in her cell, the terrible food that was making her sick, and the terrifying women she was forced to sleep next to. She told me that she did not belong in a place like this, and that she was losing her mind. Then the familiar old Aaliyah surfaced, just for a second. The calculation flickered behind her tear-filled eyes as she leaned closer to the glass, trying to play the only card she thought she had left. She lowered her voice to a desperate conspiratorial whisper. She told me that if I just paid her bail and got her out of this nightmare, she would do absolutely whatever I wanted. She promised that she would turn state's evidence and testify against Trent and our father in federal court. She claimed she knew exactly where Trent had buried the offshore shell companies, and that she had the encrypted passwords to our father's secret ledgers. She offered to hand me the final nails in their coffins if I would just open my checkbook and buy her freedom. I sat perfectly still and let her finish her frantic bargaining. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy for the tears streaming down her pale face. I remembered the decades of cruel remarks, the way she had actively participated in stripping away my inheritance, and the utter contempt she had shown me just a few weeks ago when she thought she was untouchable. She still believed she could negotiate with me. She still thought we were playing a game, where she had leverage. I reached into the plain manila folder resting on the metal counter in front of me and pulled out a thick, stapled document. I did not say a word as I slid the heavy stack of papers through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the glass partition. Aaliyah looked down at the document, her brow furrowing in confusion. She asked me what it was, and her voice trembled with sudden uncertainty. I looked directly into her bloodshot eyes and kept my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I told her that the federal investigators already had everything they needed to lock Trent and our father away for decades, and that her testimony was completely worthless to me. I told her that the document in front of her was a comprehensive and legally binding full confession detailing her exact complicity in the corporate fraud, the massive embezzlement schemes, and the covering up of Grandma's stolen assets. I watched the color completely drain from her face as she stared at the papers. I leaned into the receiver and delivered my terms with absolute cold precision. I told her that I was not going to pay her bail and that she was going to stay right there in that cell. I instructed her to sign the document and confess to every single crime she had committed. I promised her that if she signed the confession, I would use my personal funds to hire a highly connected defense attorney who could negotiate a plea deal and get her a 5-year sentence instead of the 20 years the federal prosecutors were currently drafting. But I made the final condition brutally clear. I told her that she would get absolutely nothing from the company ever again. She would forfeit all of her remaining shares, surrender any claim to the family estate, and walk away with zero financial support when she finally got out of prison. Ayalea gasped and dropped the receiver, letting it dangle by its metal cord as she read the front page of the confession. She picked the phone back up and began to argue, her voice rising in a panicked shriek. She screamed that I could not do this to her, that she was my sister, and that she was entitled to her portion of the legacy. She banged her fist against the glass, demanding that I show her some mercy after everything our family had been through. I did not flinch or raise my voice. I simply told her that the legacy she felt so entitled to was built on stolen money and that her golden child status had expired the moment the FBI kicked down her door. I tapped my finger on the glass right in front of her face and reminded her that she had no money, no allies, and no other options. I told her she could sign the paper right now, or I would walk out of the room and let the public defender handle her 20-year federal trial. The fight completely left her body. The realization of her absolute defeat crashed over her, pulling her down into the reality of her miserable situation. The manipulative anger dissolved, leaving only a hollow, broken woman staring at the ruins of her life. She picked up the cheap plastic pen chained to her side of the booth and hunched over the metal counter. Her chest heaved with violent, genuine sobs as she flipped to the last page. Her hand shook so badly she could barely grip the pen, but she pressed the tip to the paper and signed her name on the dotted line. She pushed the signed confession back through the slot and buried her face in her hands, weeping uncontrollably. The golden child had officially surrendered, and her reign over the family was dead. I picked up the confession, slid it back into my folder, and walked out of the visitation room without looking back. The bright, unfiltered sunlight outside the county jail felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, just breathing in the warm air and listening to the distant hum of the highway. The absolute control I now held over the Jeremiah logistics empire was staggering, but there was still one final piece of business that required my personal attention. I walked to my car and unlocked the door, sliding into the driver's seat. My phone buzzed with a direct message from the federal bankruptcy trustee who was working alongside my newly appointed legal team. The message confirmed that the aggressive forensic audit had uncovered exactly what I had suspected for weeks. My father had secretly used the sprawling family mansion as collateral to secure a series of desperate illegal bridge loans, attempting to keep his fraudulent shell companies afloat when the walls started closing in. Because I now held total legal control of the parent company and all of its subsidiaries, I officially held the debt. The bank had already initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings, and the county sheriff's department was scheduled to execute the eviction order this very afternoon. I put the car in drive and headed toward the exclusive gated community in Buckhead, where I had spent my entire childhood feeling like an unwanted ghost haunting the hallways. The drive took 45 minutes, but the anticipation made it feel like seconds. When I pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of the neighborhood, the private security guards did not even question my arrival. They simply opened the heavy gates and let me pass. I drove down the winding, manicured streets lined with centuries-old oak trees and sprawling estates until I reached the massive circular brick driveway of my parents' mansion. The scene unfolding on the front lawn was one of absolute chaotic destruction. 2 large white moving trucks were parked haphazardly across the pristine driveway. Several county sheriff cruisers were angled near the massive front columns, their emergency lights flashing silently in the bright afternoon sun. Deputies in dark uniforms were standing near the front door, holding clipboards and actively supervising the eviction process. The pristine, perfectly curated illusion of the Jeremiah family wealth was being ripped apart piece by piece and dragged out onto the front lawn for all the wealthy neighbors to see. My mother Brenda was standing in the center of the driveway, completely unhinged. The poised, elegant high society matriarch, who cared more about country club politics than her own daughters, was completely gone. She was wearing a silk designer blouse that was wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. Her hair was a mess of loose strands flying in the wind, and she was screaming hysterically at a pair of large moving men. The movers were attempting to carry a massive priceless oil painting out the front door, and Brenda was physically blocking their path, batting at their arms, and demanding that they leave her property alone. She was clutching an oversized designer tote bag tightly against her chest, looking like a cornered animal trying to hoard its final scraps of food before the winter. I stepped out of my car, and the heavy thud of my door closing seemed to cut through the surrounding noise. I walked slowly up the brick driveway, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. Brenda stopped screaming at the movers and whipped her head around to look at me. Her eyes widened in a mixture of pure terror and furious indignation. She recognized the absolute authority in my posture, and she knew exactly why I was there. I did not say a word to her at first. I just watched as she desperately tried to adjust the oversized tote bag under her arm. The zipper was completely broken, and sticking out of the top was a familiar ornate wooden velvet box. My heart went completely cold. It was Grandma Ruby's vintage jewelry box. The same box that held the precious heirloom pieces my grandmother had explicitly promised to me when I was a little girl. Brenda had swooped in and locked those pieces away in her private safe the day Grandma passed, claiming they were too valuable for a girl like me to appreciate. Now she was trying to smuggle them out of a foreclosed property like a common thief in the night. I walked straight past my mother and approached the lead sheriff deputy, who was holding the official inventory manifest. I pointed directly at the bulging designer bag clutched in my mother's sweating hands. I kept my voice completely steady and loud enough for everyone in the driveway to hear. I instructed the sheriff to confiscate the jewelry immediately. I told him that belongs to the estate, put it back. Brenda let out a blood-curdling shriek as the deputy stepped forward and firmly demanded that she hand over the bag. She tried to back away, sobbing wildly and screaming that the jewelry was hers, that she deserved it after everything she had suffered to build this family. The deputy did not hesitate. He reached out and took the heavy bag from her trembling arms, pulling the velvet jewelry box out and handing it directly to one of the inventory clerks. Brenda collapsed onto the hard brick driveway, weeping uncontrollably, as the last tangible pieces of her stolen, glamorous life were officially stripped away. Right at that moment, the heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion slowly opened. My father stepped out onto the wide stone porch. Jeremiah looked completely hollowed out. He was wearing a simple faded gray sweater and slacks, a stark contrast to the intimidating custom suits he had worn like armor his entire life. He looked frail and old, his face pale and lined with the heavy, irreversible weight of absolute financial and social ruin. He looked past the flashing police lights, past the moving trucks, and past his hysterical wife weeping on the ground. His eyes locked directly onto mine. There was no fight left in him, no arrogant bluster, and no manipulative charm. He just looked at me, with a completely broken, defeated expression. His voice was barely a raspy whisper when he finally spoke over the sounds of the chaotic eviction. "Are you happy now?" he asked, staring at the daughter he had spent decades treating like absolute garbage. I stood perfectly still on the manicured lawn of the estate I had just repossessed. I looked at the broken man standing on the porch and the weeping woman on the ground. I did not feel any joy or vindictive pleasure. I only felt the clean, cold precision of justice finally being served. I looked my father dead in the eyes, and my voice was perfectly calm and crystal clear. "I was happy the day I got my $30, I told him. You are the ones who could not leave well enough alone. 3 months had passed since the afternoon I watched my parents get physically evicted from their foreclosed mansion. The crisp autumn wind had finally swept through Atlanta, clearing away the suffocating summer heat and bringing a sharp, cold reality to the city. During those 90 days, I had barely slept. I spent every waking hour buried in conference rooms with federal prosecutors, forensic accountants, and Department of Justice officials, tracing every single stolen dollar back to its rotten source. The media had turned the fall of the Jeremiah family into a national spectacle, but I refused every single interview. I stayed completely in the shadows, quietly rebuilding the legitimate logistics business that my grandmother had intended, while the federal government prepared its massive ironclad criminal case. The final trial took place in a heavy mahogany paneled courtroom in the downtown federal courthouse. The room was packed to the brim with journalists, former employees, and curious onlookers who wanted to witness the final breath of a corrupt dynasty. I sat alone in the very back row of the gallery, wearing a simple tailored black suit. I did not sit behind the defense tables with the family, and I did not sit with the prosecution. I sat entirely on my own, completely detached from the nervous, suffocating energy radiating from the front of the room, where the people who used to be my family were waiting for their lives to end. The federal judge was a stern, uncompromising woman who had built her entire career dismantling white-collar crime syndicates. She did not waste any time with pleasantries as she called the court to order. The heavy wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. She started the sentencings with Trent. He stood up next to his lawyer, his posture rigid and his jaw clenched tight. The judge spent several minutes outlining his extensive money laundering network, his hidden offshore accounts, and his utter lack of remorse. She noted how he had manipulated corporate funds to line his own pockets while destroying the livelihoods of honest workers. She handed down a brutal sentence of 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Trent did not even blink or turn around to look at Ilea. He just stared at the defense table as the federal marshals stepped closer to him, his arrogant facade finally cracking under the weight of a decade and a half behind bars. Next, the judge called on Ilea. My sister stood up trembling so violently that her lawyer had to reach out and steady her by the elbow. The bright orange county jail jumpsuit hung loosely on her shrinking frame, making her look entirely pathetic and small. Because of the binding confession I had forced her to sign in the visitation room and the plea deal her expensive lawyer had negotiated, she managed to avoid the maximum penalty. The judge looked down at her over her reading glasses and stated that while her cooperation was noted, her complicity in the systematic draining of the company assets was undeniable. The judge sentenced her to exactly 5 years in federal prison. Ilea let out a soft, ragged whimper and sank back into her heavy wooden chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. She had surrendered her golden child status for a plea deal, and now she was just another convicted felon. Then came Brenda's turn. The entire courtroom seemed to grow colder as my mother was instructed to stand. The prosecution had laid out every horrifying detail of her medical tampering during the trial. They had presented the altered prescription logs, the toxic toxicology reports, and the systematic elder abuse that had slowly and agonizingly poisoned Grandma Ruby to death. The judge did not hold back. She looked directly at Brenda and called her actions monstrous, depraved and entirely driven by a sickening level of greed. Brenda was weeping openly, her face completely flushed as she begged the judge for mercy, sobbing that she was a good mother who had just made terrible mistakes. The judge silenced her with a sharp bang of the gavel and sentenced her to 10 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole for elder abuse and medical manslaughter. Brenda's cries echoed against the high ceilings of the courtroom as she begged for a mercy she had never once shown to the woman she murdered for a house she no longer owned. Finally, it was my father's turn to face the music. Jeremiah stood up before the judge looking like a hollowed-out shell of the terrifying corporate titan he used to be. His expensive tailored suits were gone, replaced by the drab beige uniform of the federal holding facility. His hair had gone completely white over the last 3 months, and his shoulders were permanently slumped. The judge spent 20 exhaustive minutes reading through the massive catalog of his corporate fraud. She detailed the illegal bridge loans, the forgery of my signature, the embezzlement, and the complete destruction of a legacy he had sworn to protect. She looked at him with absolute disgust and sentenced him to 12 long years in federal prison for orchestrating one of the largest corporate frauds in the state. As the heavy silence settled over the room, the armed bailiffs moved in to place the steel handcuffs on his wrists. Before they could secure his arms, Jeremiah slowly turned around. He scanned the crowded gallery until his tired, bloodshot eyes finally locked onto mine in the back row. He was waiting for a reaction. He desperately expected to see a gloating smile, a look of victorious triumph, or at least a hateful glare from the daughter he had abused and cast aside his entire life. He wanted some sort of confirmation that this was a passionate, emotional war between us and that my victory meant something to me. Instead, I gave him absolutely nothing. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded in my lap and looked back at him with a gaze of chilling, absolute indifference. I did not smile, and I did not frown. I just looked at him the way you look at a boring piece of furniture in a waiting room. In that split second, as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, he finally realized the most devastating truth of all. He was completely nothing to me now. His power to hurt me, his ability to control me, and his absolute reign of terror over my mind had been entirely erased. I did not hate him anymore because you have to care about someone to hate them, and I simply did not care. Jeremiah dropped his head and let the marshals lead him away toward the holding cells, his spirit permanently broken by my silence. Once the prisoners were removed, the judge slammed her wooden gavel down one last time, bringing the room back to order for her final ruling of the day. She looked over the massive stack of financial restorations and turned her attention to the civil docket. With a clear, authoritative voice, the judge officially awarded me full and undisputed control of all remaining corporate assets, the logistics empire, and the restored personal accounts. She formally declared that the estate was rightfully mine, and she issued a binding court order officially clearing my name of all lingering family debt and fraudulent liabilities. The slate had been completely wiped clean. The Jeremiah empire was dead, and my life was finally mine to begin. 6 months after the heavy wooden gavel fell in that downtown courtroom, the suffocating shadow of Jeremiah's legacy had been completely swept away from the city of Atlanta. My life was finally my own, and I started the new chapter exactly where everything had begun. The old decaying property in the historic West End, the place my family had cruelly dismissed as a junk house, was no longer a crumbling monument to neglect. I had poured my heart, my soul, and a significant portion of my newly secured capital into completely restoring Grandma Ruby's home. I hired a team of local architects and craftsmen to breathe life back into the bones of the estate. We kept the original red brick facade and the sweeping wraparound porch that held so many of my warmest childhood memories. But we expanded the back of the house into a stunning modern architectural masterpiece of floor-to-ceiling glass and sustainable steel. It was the perfect marriage of the historical West End soul and the bright, limitless future I was building. The interior was filled with local art, warm wood tones, and the simple, honest elegance that my grandmother had always cherished. To celebrate the completion of the renovation, I decided to host a massive block party for the entire neighborhood. I wanted to honor Grandma Ruby's spirit of community and generosity, a spirit my parents had spent their entire lives trying to bury under their toxic elitism. The street was blocked off and filled with the rich, smoky smell of local barbecue and the heavy, joyful bass of live music. String lights hung between the old oak trees, casting a warm, golden glow over the hundreds of neighbors, friends, and former employees who had gathered to celebrate. There were children laughing and running across the manicured lawn, while older residents sat on the wide porch sharing stories about my grandmother and the legacy she had left behind. It was a scene of pure, unfiltered joy, and it stood in stark contrast to the sterile, forced charity galas my mother used to host in her heavily guarded mansion. The transformation of the house was only the physical manifestation of a much larger revolution. The corporate empire that my father had polluted with his greed had undergone a massive, unforgiving restructuring. Jeremiah Logistics was officially dead and buried. In its place, I launched Ruby Logistics. I gutted the entire executive board and replaced them with diverse, innovative leaders who actually understood the value of the people doing the heavy lifting. Within the first 90 days of taking control, I instituted sweeping reforms that shocked the industry. I established guaranteed fair living wages for every single driver and warehouse worker. I openly supported the unions that my father had spent millions trying to bust, and I created a comprehensive college scholarship fund specifically dedicated to supporting Black youth across Atlanta. Ruby Logistics was no longer a machine built to exploit the vulnerable. It was a thriving community engine designed to uplift everyone connected to it. Walking through the bright, clean warehouses and seeing the genuine smiles on the faces of my employees was the greatest return on investment I could have ever asked for. As I walked through the block party greeting neighbors and holding a simple plastic cup of sweet tea, I noticed a sleek black town car pull up to the barricade at the end of the street. A tall, older man with silver hair, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, stepped out and began walking down the pavement, looking completely out of place among the casual neighborhood crowd. I recognized him immediately. It was Victor Sterling, an old, ruthless business rival of my father, who owned a massive competing supply chain network across the Southeast. Victor had spent decades trading blows with Jeremiah, and he had clearly come here tonight thinking he could take advantage of the shifting tides. He navigated through the dancing crowd with a look of mild disgust on his face, until he found me standing near the edge of the new modern garden. He approached me with his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft grass. He did not bother offering a polite greeting or expressing condolences for the family implosion. Instead, he looked at me with a condescending, patronizing smile that reminded me entirely too much of Trent. He told me that he had heard about my little philanthropic experiments with the company and that he was worried I was in over my head. He chuckled softly and said that running a multi-million-dollar logistics empire was not a charity project for little girls playing house. He smoothly reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, offering it to me like it was a lifeline. He told me he was prepared to buy Ruby Logistics for a flat cash sum, saving me from the inevitable collapse of my naive business model. The number on the paper was an insulting lowball offer, a fraction of what the company was actually worth. He stood there waiting for me to eagerly accept his rescue, thinking I was just a frightened child playing dress-up in my father's oversized shoes. I did not take the paper from his hand. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of being intimidated by the wealthy titan standing on my lawn. I just took a slow sip of my sweet tea and looked him directly in the eyes. The warm, festive sounds of the block party faded into the background as I held his gaze with a cold, calculating precision. I told him that I was well aware of his recent aggressive expansion into the Midwest, but that my forensic accounting team had also discovered the hidden default notices on his primary distribution centers in Ohio. I kept my voice perfectly level as I informed him that I knew his parent company was currently leveraging empty shell accounts to hide a massive cash flow deficit from the federal regulators. Victor Sterling's condescending smile completely vanished. The smug arrogance drained from his face in an instant, leaving behind a pale mask of absolute shock. His hand slowly dropped to his side, the insulting buyout offer suddenly feeling like a heavy, useless weight. He realized in that terrifying instant that I had not just inherited a company, I had mapped out the entire board. I leaned in slightly and told him that if he ever brought his tired, condescending, patriarchal garbage onto my property again, I would personally forward his hidden accounting ledgers to the Securities and Exchange Commission before he even made it back to his town car. I watched the powerful corporate giant swallow hard and take a stumbling step backward. He did not say another word. He simply turned around and walked quickly back to his waiting car, looking like a man who had just narrowly escaped a burning building. As his car sped away into the night, the word of our encounter rippled out beyond the neighborhood and into the heavy hitters of the business world. They finally understood that the little girl they thought they could easily manipulate was actually a terrifying force of nature. I stood on the porch of Grandma Ruby's beautiful restored home, listening to the music and watching the people I cared about celebrate a brand new day, knowing that my empire was built on a foundation of absolute unshakable steel. The music outside finally began to fade as the block party gently wound down, wrapping the historic West End neighborhood in a comfortable, quiet peace. I stepped back inside the house, pulling the heavy wooden front door shut behind me and letting the sudden stillness of the foyer wash over me. The air inside smelled of fresh cedar polish and the faint lingering scent of the lavender incense my grandmother used to burn. I walked slowly through the wide hallways, letting my fingers trail along the smooth, restored wainscoting. This house had once been a symbol of everything my parents despised about our history, but now it stood as a monument to everything they could never destroy. I made my way into the grand living room, where the warm, ambient light from the modern fixtures cast a soft glow across the rich hardwood floors. I walked over to the far wall where a custom-built shadow box hung in the center of the room, illuminated by a single perfectly angled spotlight. I stood there in the quiet room and stared through the pristine museum glass. Resting inside on a bed of dark green velvet were two old pieces of currency, a crisp 1928 $20 bill and a slightly worn $10 bill. That $30 was the entire foundation of my empire. It was the exact amount my grandmother had pressed into my hands all those years ago, telling me to invest in my own mind. It was the same $30 that my father had laughed at, that my mother had mocked, and that my siblings had dismissed as pathetic pocket change. Looking at those two bills now safely preserved under glass, I felt a profound wave of closure settling deep into my bones. They had stolen millions from this family and ended up with absolutely nothing. I had started with $30 and built a legacy that would outlive us all. I walked over to the wet bar tucked into the corner of the living room and picked up a heavy crystal decanter. I poured a generous measure of expensive aged bourbon into a glass, listening to the rich amber liquid splash against the bottom. I turned back to face the empty room and raised my glass in a silent toast to the incredible woman who had seen my potential before anyone else even cared to look. As the smooth warmth of the bourbon slid down my throat, I thought about the people who were currently cleaning up outside on the lawn. My fierce, dedicated legal team who had fought tooth and nail to secure my future. The brilliant, innovative colleagues who were currently helping me revolutionize Ruby Logistics. The resilient community leaders who had rallied around me the moment I decided to invest back into the neighborhood. They were my true family now. They were a family forged in mutual respect, shared values, and genuine, unwavering support. As I stood there in the comfortable silence, I realized with absolute certainty that I did not miss my blood relatives at all. I did not miss the constant suffocating pressure of my father's impossible expectations. I did not miss the sharp, venomous critiques that my mother used to disguise as maternal concern. I did not miss the arrogant entitlement of my brother or the vicious, calculated jealousy of my sister. They were strangers to me now, ghost stories from a past life that could no longer haunt me. The mansion in Buckhead was gone. The shell companies were dismantled, and the toxic empire they had built on the backs of others had been completely scrubbed from the earth. A few days after the block party, I was sitting at the large oak desk in my home office, reviewing the quarterly projections for the new logistics routes. The morning sun was pouring through the large picture windows, warming the room and casting bright geometric shapes across the floor. My assistant had dropped off the morning mail, a neat stack of sorted envelopes resting on the corner of my desk. I reached over and began sifting through the pile until my hand stopped on a plain white envelope stamped with the unmistakable rigid seal of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The return address belonged to a maximum security penitentiary in Florida, and the sender name was printed in sharp, jagged handwriting that I would recognize anywhere. It was a letter from Jeremiah. I opened the envelope slowly, the paper tearing with a loud, crisp rip in the quiet office. I unfolded the single sheet of lined notebook paper and began to read. The man who used to terrorize boardrooms and crush his competitors with absolute impunity was now writing a desperate, pathetic plea to the daughter he had spent his entire life treating like garbage. He complained bitterly about the terrible conditions of the prison, writing about the damp, cold walls and the miserable, tasteless food they served in the cafeteria. He said that his arthritis was flaring up and the prison doctors were ignoring him. Then he finally got to the point of the letter. He begged me to deposit some money into his commissary account so he could afford extra blankets and some decent snacks. He actually had the audacity to write that we were still family and that a daughter should not let her father suffer in his old age. I read the letter twice just to fully absorb the staggering irony of his situation. He had stripped my grandmother of her assets, manipulated my trust fund, and tried to leave me with a massive, crushing debt. Now he was sitting in a concrete cell begging me for pocket change. I did not feel angry or sad. I just felt the corners of my mouth turn up into a genuine, relaxed smile. I opened my top desk drawer and pulled out my personal checkbook. I picked up my pen and wrote out a check to the Federal Prison Commissary System. I carefully filled in the amount section, writing out the number 30 with a smooth, precise stroke. I looked at the small printed memo line at the bottom of the check and thought about the decades of corporate greed and cruel calculation that had ultimately put him behind bars. Down in that small corner, I wrote 3 simple words: for your ROI, your return on investment. I tore the check from the booklet, folded it neatly, and slipped it into a fresh envelope addressed to the prison. I did not include a letter, a note, or a single word of explanation. The $30 was the only answer he would ever receive from me. I sealed the envelope and grabbed my keys, walking out the front door of Grandma Ruby's house. The bright, vibrant Atlanta sun washed over me as I walked down the driveway to the mailbox. I opened the metal lid, dropped the envelope inside, and pushed the red flag up into the air. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood waking up around me. The air was fresh and sweet, and the heavy weight of the past was finally gone forever. I took a deep breath of the morning air, feeling completely untouchable and entirely at peace as I turned around and walked back into the beautiful, brilliant life that I had built all on my own. The greatest lesson from this journey is that your true worth is never defined by those who are blinded by their own selfishness. When the people who are supposed to protect you choose to tear you down, instead you have to find the courage to build your own sanctuary. Blood does not make a family, but respect, loyalty, and genuine love do. True power comes from walking away from toxic expectations and realizing you are enough exactly as you are. You do not need their validation to create a beautiful, successful life. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to find your own peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys of healing.